Okay. Elena Hewitt. JC Sturdivant. Tony Passalacqua. Kevin Block. Brittany Bowman. Nathaniel Clifton. Caroline is joining virtually, and Andre Walker. Okay. So, our plan for today is I'm mostly going to be going over John Locke's version of social contract theory. So as you've hopefully seen, there were 2 videos posted to Blackboard this week. One on Hobbes' version of the social contract, one on Smith. The Smith one, it doesn't really matter where in the series you watch it, but I'm hoping everyone has already seen the Hobbes one, because I will be referring back and forth to sort of Locke and Hobbes today. Okay, and then also just a reminder before I get started that your first writing assignment is due Monday, right? So if you have any questions about the journal, feel free to email me, but don't let that slip your mind. Okay. So one of the things I want to do is sort of compare Hobbes and Locke, because in a lot of ways Locke is similar to Hobbes, but he has some significant differences. So if we look back on Hobbes' vision of the state of nature, right? It's terrible, it's chaotic, it's kind of desperate, and the people are willing to do anything to get out of it. So they come together, right, and they create the social contract and say, okay, we're going to create a government so that we have something to organize us and we can get out of this chaos. And one thing I want to talk about starting out is why things are so chaotic at Hobbes. And so a little bit of terminology you need. Positive law versus natural law. So a positive law is an official law of a government, right? We often use the term written law, though it wouldn't technically have to be written depending on, what sort of society you're in. But however, in your society, the government officially passes a law. That's a positive law. It's what most people mean when they use the term law. This is to contrast with natural law. Natural law is the idea that human beings can naturally understand right and wrong, right? And because Hobbes doesn't believe in natural law, right, that's why his vision of the state of nature is so chaotic. Where for law, right, natural law exists, and therefore, even in the state of nature, even with no government, there is still some order to things. And we have the development of social institutions, and we have the development of economic relationships, right? But one of the things that Locke sees in the state of nature that is not perfect is, if you remember, we talked a little bit about the vigilante justice system, right, in Locke's state of nature. And so Locke looks at the vigilante justice system, and he says, okay, there are a lot of ways where that is not ideal, right? One, because it's not going to be perfectly fair, because the victim of the case is deciding the case, right? And 2, because it's inconvenient. And he says, people in the state of nature will realize that vigilante justice is not actually the best way to handle crime, right? Because 1, people are going to get widely different sentences depending on the attitude of the particular victim of that crime, right? So 2 people could commit the exact same crime. They both steal a cow, but one of them happens to steal a cow from a very like live and let live, turn the other cheek, forgive your enemies type person, who just basically makes them give the cow back and promise they'll never do it again. Someone else steals a cow from someone who is very angry and believes very strongly in revenge, and they end up getting hanged. And so Locke says this isn't a fair system. He says it's also not fair because it's really hard to be unbiased when you yourself were directly affected by the crime. So he says, okay, it's not the best way to handle things. It's also really inconvenient because the average person doesn't want to have to drop whatever they're doing and go form a posse and hunt down a criminal every time a crime is committed. Does that make sense? So he says the people in the state of nature realize this isn't an ideal system. And it's this vigilante justice that pushes them to say, okay, I think we can do this better. I think we need a more formalized set of rules and a more formalized way of enforcing those rules. And so in Locke's state of nature, the people do get together, right? Similar to Hobbes, they make an agreement with each other to create a government, and they create the government. Two things here, though. One is they're not doing this out of desperation. They're doing this because they think their current system isn't the best. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. The other thing is Locke's version of the social contract has a lot more rules in place. Because Locke believes that natural law existed right before the government ever existed. And included in that natural law is the concept of inalienable rights. So an inalienable right is a right that you cannot give away, even if you were willing to. So Locke would say, for example, if you were, shipwrecked and you get rescued and you say, listen, if you share your food and water with me, I will be your slave for the rest of my life. Locke would say you can't make that deal. That like certain things can't be given up, even if the person in question was desperate enough and willing to do it. He says people can't barter away their life. They can't barter away their liberty. And they can't barter away their basic rights. And he says, so there are certain things that the government can't do because they would violate natural law. And this is in contrast, right, with Hobbes, because with Hobbes, if you remember from my video, the government and freedom is very all or nothing, right? Either you're absolutely free because you can do anything you want, or you can't, in which case you're not free. For Locke, freedom can be divided up. And you can give up some of your freedom without giving up all of your freedom. Does that make sense? And so Locke says when the people get together to create the government and they create the social contract, they don't give up all of their freedoms. They just give up some of their freedoms. And he says the only freedom they actually have to give up is the right of revenge. That idea in the state of nature that if someone in some way hurts you or violates your rights, you get to hunt them down and attack them and punish them yourself. He says that you have to give up. He says, but other than that, you don't have to give up the rest of your freedom. And in particular, there are some freedoms you can't give up. Does that make sense? And so Locke's social contract has a lot more rules in place compared to Hobbes. Right? Hobbes, it's a contract, but it's a very simple contract. The government protects me from violent death. I obey the government, period. For Locke, there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more that the government has to do for me to legitimize itself. The government has to respect all of my natural rights. The government has to protect all of my natural rights from violations by my neighbors or anyone else. And so there are a lot more situations in Locke where you can say, well, wait a minute, that's not okay. Does that make sense? Where for Hobbes, like, the government has one job: keep you from being murdered. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions so far? So then I want to talk a little bit about revolutions, because obviously you're going to end up with very different ideas about revolutions in Locke and Hobbes. In Locke, right, because there are a lot of rules for the government, it's not that hard to justify a revolution. Because Locke says if the government breaks any of those rules, you are justified in rebelling. And in fact, he says if the government is violating anyone's rights, it's not just okay for you to rebel, you are morally obligated to rebel against that government. Right? And this is why Locke is who gets, basically plagiarized in the Declaration of Independence. Because under Locke's theory, it's not that hard to justify a revolution. And Locke is going to say, like, worst case scenario, right, you go back to the state of nature. If you've got a bad government, worst case scenario, you overthrow it and you just go back to the state of nature. Because the state of nature, again, for Locke, is not that bad. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, the state of nature is not that bad. You can always go back to it. And so Locke is going to very explicitly say that you're better off with no government than with a bad government. Right? And so he's not along with, like, Rousseau and some of the people we're going to read next week saying governments are bad in general and we should get rid of them. He's going to say it depends on the type of government, right? A good government, he thinks, is an improvement on the state of nature because it helps sort of formalize your rules. It helps organize that sort of criminal justice system. It makes things a little bit more fair because everyone is being, having the same rules applied by the same magistrate. So that's good. But if you happen to have a bad or corrupt government, that's worse than no government at all. Okay, so to contrast that with Hobbes, right? Hobbes is going to say any government is better than the state of nature. Because the state of nature for Hobbes is constant chaos and constant threats of violence. The only time for Hobbes you are justified in disobeying the government is if your life is directly under threat. Either the government itself is trying to kill you, in which case he says, yeah, you don't have to obey, or the government is not stopping someone else from killing you. He says if it's that latter case, the government isn't stopping other people from killing you, he says that's when you technically don't have a government, right? If they're not maintaining order, then they're not the government. And this is where we get into some more terminology here. Power versus authority. So power is the ability to make someone do what you want. Power is the ability to make someone do what you want. That can be hard power, right? Threats of force or violence or punishment. It can also be soft power. Persuasion, information, monetary rewards, any sort of like, you do me a favor, I'll do you a favor. But all of those generally fall under the category of power. Authority is the legitimate right to tell someone what to do. It's a legitimate right to tell someone what to do. So if an institution or a person has authority, it's not just that they tell me what to do, but I really believe that I should listen to them. that it would like be wrong for me to disobey them, right? So you can think of it in a political sense of following the law, but you could also think of it, right, as like your mom telling you, asking you to do something. If you feel she asks you to do something, morally you kind of have to do it, that's authority. Does that make sense? Okay. Hobbes doesn't really believe in authority. This idea that some people have the right to give orders and others don't. He thinks that's kind of a nice fairy tale. He thinks what really matters is power. Do you actually have the ability to back up your commands and make people obey them? And he says the government is whoever has the power to maintain law and order. Whoever can actually maintain law and order. Does that make sense? Okay. So, this is where things get a little bit weird when it comes to Hobbes and revolutions. Because for Hobbes, you are almost never justified in starting a revolution. Again, basically, unless the government is actively trying to kill you, you can't start a revolution in Hobbes. However, if someone else starts a revolution and they are fairly successful, and it gets to the point where in the place where you are, the rebels have more power than the official government, then you are justified in joining the rebels. Because they're the ones with power, so they're actually the government. And that's who you should obey. Does that make sense? And so you end up with Hobbes on revolutions with a weird sort of critical mass aspect, where starting a revolution is almost always bad. Sort of like if you were Jewish and living in Nazi Germany, okay, fine, they are actually trying to murder you. But he's going to say anything short of that. You can't start a revolution. But again, if someone else starts a revolution and they're successful, then you are justified in joining them kind of halfway through. Does that make sense? Sort of the idea is if they're sufficiently successful, joining them to tip the balance and go ahead and end the war and get the new government in place and running normally is what's going to lead to less chaos rather than continuing on the war, is sort of his idea. Does that make sense? Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit, because we've brought in Hobbes and we've done some contrasting with Hobbes and Locke. What I want to talk about now is a little bit of why Hobbes loves geometry. Because geometry is Hobbes' favorite subject. He thinks it is the best, most perfect science. And he thinks all other types of learning need to be more like geometry. So, the reason why Hobbes loves geometry is deductive as opposed to inductive. So deductive is where you make a rule or a definition, and then everything has to follow from that rule, right? So a triangle has 3 sides, right? We just say that, and then we know any shape that has 3 sides is a triangle. We don't go out into the wild and capture 1,000 triangles and count their sides. Right, we just set it as a rule, and then we know any shape with 3 sides must be a triangle. That's deductive. Inductive is the other side of that. Inductive is where you look at all of the real-world examples, and you try to generalize rules based on what you see. Right, so a biologist goes out, they collect 1,000 examples of different birds from all over the world. They say, okay, they all have feathers. I'm going to posit that birds all have feathers. Right? Hobbes thinks deductive is superior to inductive because in deductive reasoning, there's never an exception. because, again, the rules define the categories. In inductive reasoning, there can be exceptions, right? You may collect 400 cases that all fit your rule, and then the 401st doesn't, right? So you go around the world collecting examples of fish, you say, okay, fish all have scales, and then someone shows up with a catfish. And you're like, oh, wait, okay, we need to revise that rule. That doesn't happen in geometry, right? You never have to worry about a mathematician going out in the field and finding a four-sided triangle, right? People are just like, dude, that's a rectangle, let it go. This is why Hobbes thinks geometry is perfect, right? There are no exceptions, they're perfect, right? He's a very black and white thinker. He tries to bring this sort of attitude to political science, right? So the idea of like, whoever has power is the government, right? We don't have to worry about transitions of power between governments because if you have the power, you're the government. If you don't have the power, you're not the government, period. Does that make sense? He's also going to use this approach when he discusses the concept of justice. Because for Hobbes, he defines justice as obeying the laws of the government. And so, because again, he doesn't think natural law exists. So what other rules are there? Well, they're just the laws of the government. So, and this is going to come up, like next week, we're going to discuss civil disobedience and some thinkers who really get into these questions of what should you do if your government is acting unjustly. We're going to read Martin Luther King Jr., we're going to read Henry David Thoreau, right? We're going to have this whole conversation about that. For Hobbes, that sort of conflict can never happen because justice is following the law. So the idea of an unjust law makes about as much sense to him as a four-sided triangle. It just can't logically happen. Does that make sense? And so this sort of draws in, again, this sort of black and white, very deductive, you make the rules kind of reasoning. Does that make sense? Okay, any questions there so far? So then I want to dive back into Locke for a little bit. I've got two more points I want to make on Locke, and then we might wrap up a little bit early today. But one of them is the question, right? So in both Hobbes and Locke, the government is legitimate and you have to obey it because you, the people, created it. You consented to it. Locke then brings up the question of, okay, but what about the people that are born after the government has already been created? Which a lot of social contract thinkers kind of like to ignore that problem. And they just say, well, you have to obey because you consented. And he says, well, okay, in reality, most people don't have that opportunity, right? Most people in the world are born under a government that exists, live and die all under that same government. So he distinguishes consent in two different ways. There is explicit consent and tacit / implicit consent. So explicit consent, also sometimes called expressed, is, right, the people who are actually have that opportunity to say, yes, we want this government, right? So if you think back to the people who were around and had the opportunity to actually vote on the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, they had explicit consent. They got to actively say, like, yes, this is the system of government we want. I would also put into this category people who immigrate to a country as an adult, right, who get to actively choose, yes, this is the political community I want to be a part of. But again, as Locke acknowledges, that's not a majority of people worldwide. That's where tacit consent comes in. So the way tacit consent works for Locke, again, you're born under an existing government. He says at some point in your life, you are receiving benefits from living under that government, right? Maybe you attend public schools that are funded through taxes. Maybe you drive on roads that are maintained through taxes. Maybe you are not invaded by North Korea because our military is there and patrolling. You may not even realize when it happens, right? You may be walking down the street one day and someone was thinking of mugging you, and then they saw a cop car driving by and was like, oh, I better not. Right? You may have never even been aware that you were in danger. But you get that benefit. And he says, by accepting those benefits, you then owe obedience to the government. And that's the idea of tacit consent. You've gotten these benefits, you've accepted them, therefore you still owe your end of the contract, even if you didn't have the opportunity to write the contract. So sort of the idea of like, let's say the people who owned my house before me had a contract with a lawn service crew, and they show up once a week and they mow the lawn and they trim the hedges and they rake and all of this stuff. And they're supposed to get paid $50 for doing that. Well, I didn't sign that contract, but if they show up and I let them go ahead and mow my lawn and trim the hedges and rake and everything, then I should probably pay them the $50, right? If I didn't want to do that, I should have stopped them before they started the work. That's sort of what Locke is saying here. If you're accepting those benefits, then you owe obedience. Now he says, well, what if you don't want to accept those benefits? Locke's answer is then you do, he says, always have the right to emigrate. And that's going to be his solution of, well, what if I'm born under a contract that I'm not okay with? He's going to say, then leave and move someplace else. Does that make sense? I don't think this is a perfect answer to this question, and it's not the only one you'll see. It's probably the only one you'll see in this class, but like in life, right? Thomas Jefferson, for example, thought that every generation needed, if not a full-scale revolution, at least their own constitutional convention to hammer out what type of government they thought they should be living under, right? So there are other solutions, but Locke at least is one of the earliest ones in the social contract tradition to acknowledge this sort of thorny problem of, okay, what about the people who come later after the contract is already existing? Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions so far on Locke or Hobbes? Then there's just one more thing I want to cover on Locke. And this is to sort of clarify, because I've noticed a lot of students getting mixed up on this in the past. Locke is not a Democrat, right? This is not government by and for the people. It's government created by the people, but they don't necessarily continue to run that government. Locke is totally okay with a monarchy. He's living under a monarchy when he's writing. What Locke does care about is the idea that there are limits on what any government can legitimately do, right? That natural law existed before governments, that certain things are right and wrong, and that the king is limited in what he can do in the same way everyone else is, right? If you think of it, again, because Locke himself is very religious, right? The king still has to obey God's laws just like everyone else. Which means, you know, no matter how much power he has, he can't go around raping and murdering and stealing people's property. That's what he cares about, is that sort of that there are limits on the government's power and that the people still have individual rights. Whether that government is a democracy or a monarchy, that's not his main concern. He still thinks it's okay to have a monarch, again, as long as it's one of these sort of limited monarchs. Does that make sense? Because I think a lot of people then, because Jefferson borrows so much from Locke, assume that Locke agrees with Jefferson on points about democracy, which again, he doesn't. Locke's concern is whether your government has limits, not actually what type of government it is. Okay. Questions, concerns, comments so far? Then just two more little reminders. I'm not going to talk about Smith too much today because I do have the video posted on Blackboard on Smith. But again, he is going to be more interested in sort of the economic development in terms of society. And then again, just another reminder that the first journal is due on Monday. And so make sure you're looking at that and working on that over the weekend. Okay? In that case, I will see you next week.